Hi everyone, welcome to Azad Revenge Stories channel. My father didn't just kick me from the head table at his retirement party. He looked right at me before everyone and declared I was never his real daughter. I hit the floor amidst clinking glasses while the woman taking my seat smiled triumphantly. But my husband didn't move to fight. He unbuttoned his jacket, pulling out a thick red envelope, enough evidence to torch the elaborate lie they had built around my father. My name is Alexis Ruiz. I am 33 years old, and tonight I am standing in the grand foyer of the Copper Pine Lodge, clutching a small evening purse so tightly my knuckles are completely white. It has been almost 2 years since I last spoke to my adoptive father, Owen Callahan. 2 years of unanswered text messages, returned holiday cards, and a heavy silence that left a hollow ache in my chest. I never understood why the freeze-out happened. 1 month we were having Sunday dinners, and the next I was entirely shut out of his life. Tonight is his grand retirement party, celebrating his 3 decades at high desert grid services. I received a generic mass email invitation and against every instinct screaming at me to stay home. I came. My husband, Noah Ruiz, walks beside me, his steady presence the only thing keeping my legs from giving out right here in the lobby. We stepped through the double oak doors and into the sprawling ballroom. The vated ceilings and rustic iron chandeliers scream old corporate money. Waiters weave through the crowd carrying trays of champagne. I immediately scan the room looking for the seating chart displayed on a massive mirror near the entrance. My eyes trace the elegant gold calligraphy, searching for my table number. I find the placard for the head table first. I see the name Celeste Arden. I see the name Sloan Arden. I see Owen Callahan listed alongside the senior executives of the company. I scan the list again, tracing every single letter. My name is nowhere to be found. The head table, the traditional place of honor reserved for the immediate family, has meticulously excluded me. Before the sharp sting of that realization can fully register, a figure glides toward us from the center of the room. It is Celeste, my stepmother. She wears a stunning emerald green gown and a smile so perfectly polite it makes my blood run cold. She greets the other corporate guests warmly, but when her eyes lock onto mine, the superficial warmth vanishes, replaced by a chilling satisfaction. She does not offer a hug. She simply extends a manicured hand toward the back of the room and signals a waiter. She instructs him to escort Noah and me to a small overflow table pressed hard against the far back wall right next to the swinging kitchen doors. We are seated like an afterthought, treated like uninvited strangers. Noah places his warm hand over my trembling one under the table, his jaw tightening in barely concealed anger, but he remains completely silent. An hour passes. The lights in the ballroom dim, signaling the start of the main presentation. The low murmur of the crowd fades as a massive white projector screen slowly lowers from the ceiling. A slideshow titled The Family Man, Owen Callahan, begins to play over the speakers. Soft acoustic music fills the room. I sit up straight, holding my breath, desperately waiting for a glimpse of my past. Instead, I am forced to watch a highly curated, entirely rewritten version of family history. There are glossy photos of Owen and Celeste clinking crystal flutes in Paris. There are vibrant pictures of Owen and Sloan skiing down slopes in Aspen. There are endless snapshots of luxury vacations and lavish holiday dinners. I sit in the dark and watch for 5 minutes. I watch for 10 minutes. The slideshow finally loops back to the beginning. There is not a single photograph of me in the entire presentation. Worse, there is not a single photograph of my late mother, Marisol. It is exactly as if the first 30 years of my father's life have been surgically excised from existence. The master of ceremonies steps up to the wooden podium. He raises his glass to the room. He speaks passionately about Owen's dedication to the power grid, his brilliant engineering mind, and his unwavering commitment to his loved ones. Then the executive looks directly over at the head table. He raises his glass higher and toasts the devoted father, Owen Callahan, praising him for raising such a wonderful daughter. He looks right at Sloan and calls her Owen's greatest pride and joy. The entire room erupts into thunderous applause. Sloan, my stepsister, who is exactly 1 year younger than me, smiles demurely and rests her head affectionately on my father's shoulder. I sit frozen in the dim light by the kitchen doors, the horrifying realization crashing over me. This entire night was not just about my father retiring. It was a carefully orchestrated stage play designed by Celeste to publicly and permanently erase me from the family history. I cannot sit there anymore. The gross injustice of it all burns too hot in my throat. I push my heavy wooden chair back, the legs scraping against the floorboards. No gives me a sharp look, silently asking if I'm sure, that I give him a firm nod. I have to hear the truth from him directly. I walk alone across the massive ballroom. The distance from the kitchen doors to the stage feels like walking for miles. The clinking of expensive silver, and the happy chatter of over 80 people fade into a dull roar. I finally approach the elevated head. There is an empty chair right next to Owen. I step very close to my father. He looks up at me, and for a fraction of a second, I swear I see the kind man who used to patiently teach me how to read complex blueprints. I open my mouth, planning to just ask him for exactly 60 seconds of his time to speak privately in the hallway. But before I can form a single word, Celeste leans in close. She whispers something dark into his ear. My father's eyes harden instantly. The brief warmth freezes over completely. He looks at me not as his grieving daughter, but as a threat to his perfect evening. Owen stands up abruptly. His chair scrapes violently against the wood floor, drawing the immediate attention of the nearby tables. He steps quickly around the large table and physically blocks my path to the empty chair. A heavy silence spreads through the front half of the room. People stop eating. People stop talking. He leans in close to me, his face twisted in a cold fury I have never once seen in him before. He grits out his words, keeping his voice low but loud enough for the first 3 rows of guest tables to hear every single syllable perfectly. He tells me that the chair I am looking at is strictly reserved for his real daughter. Before those devastating words can fully process in my stunned brain, my father raises his 2 hands and shoves me. He shoves me backward with terrifying force. I immediately lose my footing in my tall heels. The entire room tilts violently around me. I hit the solid hardwood floor with a sickening thud, the sharp impact knocking the breath entirely out of my lungs. The collective gasp of more than 80 shocked guests echoes loudly in the massive ballroom. I am lying on the floor, publicly humiliated, staring up in utter disbelief at the very man who once promised he would always protect me. My small evening clutch bursts open upon hitting the ground. My lipstick rolls away under a table and fluttering gently to the ground, landing perfectly face up directly under the harsh glare of the chandelier light is a very old faded photograph. It is the cherished picture of Owen proudly signing my legal adoption papers when I was exactly 7 years old, both of us grinning happily in the county courthouse. I look frantically from the old photo on the floor up to his face, desperately expecting to see a flash of deep regret that he has already turned his back to me, casually gesturing for Sloane to come over and take the empty seat beside him. Then the heavy atmosphere in the room abruptly shifts. The sharp sound of slow, deliberate footsteps cuts right through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Noah walks steadily out from the dark shadows of our back table. He does not rush frantically to help me up right away. He does not yell out in anger. He does not try to throw a punch at my father. Instead, his handsome face is a rigid mask of pure, calculated calm. He stops just a few feet away from the head table, forcing Owen to turn back around. Noah methodically and slowly adjusts the cuffs of his dark, tailored suit jacket, his dark eyes locked dead onto Celeste's suddenly pale face. In his right hand, he holds a bright, thick red envelope. It is heavy, securely sealed, and packed tightly with every single piece of devastating financial and digital evidence we uncovered over the last 48 hours. The arrogant smile on Celeste's face begins to falter and crack. The air seems to get sucked right out of the room as Noah gently taps the thick red envelope against his palm. I know with absolute certainty that this night no longer belongs to my stepmother. I was barely 3 years old when my biological father packed his bags and drove away from our dusty neighborhood in New Mexico without so much as a backward glance. I do not have many distinct memories of him, just the fading image of a truck kicking up gravel and a lingering sense of cold absence. But the universe has a strange way of balancing its ledgers. Shortly after that departure, Owen stepped into our lives. He did not come bearing overwhelming pity or an exaggerated sense of duty toward a single mother and her toddler. He simply arrived with quiet certainty and stayed. He was an engineer by trade and a builder by nature. While other men might have tiptoed around a child that was not of their own blood, Owen dove right in head first. He was the one who ran behind my bicycle on the cracked sidewalks, letting go of the seat only when he knew my balance was completely steady, patting up my scraped knees with clumsy bandages and calm words of encouragement. He did not just teach me the typical childhood lessons. He treated me like a capable apprentice in the vast workshop of the world. On long, blazing summer afternoons, he would spread massive, complicated construction blueprints across our worn dining table. He taught me how to read the intricate grids, how to understand the load-bearing walls, and how to see a finished structure long before the foundation was ever poured into the dirt. He taught me the practical magic of the earth, like how to stand on the back porch, close my eyes, and inhale deeply to catch the sharp metallic scent of ozone and wet creased soap bush before a desert thunderstorm finally broke across the evening sky. He anchored me to the world with a fierce, quiet devotion that made the concept of biological genetics feel utterly irrelevant. Our home was the center of my universe, held together by the gentle yet incredibly sharp spirit of my mother, Marisol Viger. She was a dedicated school librarian who possessed a unique ability to command a room with a soft whisper rather than a loud shout. She transformed our small adobe house into an absolute sanctuary. The thick earthen walls kept the brutal desert heat at bay, but the true warmth came entirely from inside. Every horizontal surface in our living room was occupied by towering stacks of hardback library books. The rich, spicy aroma of Mexican cinnamon coffee seemed permanently woven into the fabric of the window curtains. In the evenings, after Owen returned from the grid sites and my mother finished cataloging her reading lists, she would play old soulful records on a vintage turntable. The melodic sounds of brass horns and soft vocals filled the space, creating a perfect harmony with Owen's pragmatic, grounded nature. They were two halves of a beautiful whole, and I was safely nestled right in the middle. The absolute defining moment of my life happened when I was exactly 7 years old. It was a crisp autumn morning, and we drove down to the county courthouse in the center of town. I vividly remember the heavy oak doors, the echoing marble hallways, and the serious face of the judge sitting high up on the wooden bench. But the only memory that truly matters is what happened in the corridor right after the heavy wooden gavel fell. Owen pulled me aside, away from the bustling crowd of busy lawyers and hurrying clerks. He lowered his tall frame, dropping down onto one knee so that his eyes were perfectly level with mine. He placed his large, calloused hands gently on my small shoulders. His expression was fiercely earnest as he looked directly into my eyes and delivered a truth I would carry inside my chest for the rest of my life. He told me that family is not a thing decided by blood, but rather it is about the person who chooses to stay. From that day forward, I grew up armed with an unshakable bulletproof belief. I was chosen. I was not a burden begrudgingly accepted out of obligation. I was actively selected from the entire world to be his daughter. That profound realization forged a bond between us that felt infinitely stronger and more resilient than many families connected by mere biological DNA. I carried his last name with a deep pride that shaped my entire identity. That unyielding foundation was tested to its absolute limits when I turned 14 years old. On a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the vibrant, warm center of our adobe house collapsed without warning. Marisol suffered a sudden, massive, ruptured brain aneurysm. There were no warning signs, no long goodbyes, just a frantic ambulance ride in the sterile, blinding fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room. When the emergency room doctor delivered the devastating news, Owen did not shatter into a million pieces in front of me. He absorbed the catastrophic blow like the deeply rooted oak tree taking a direct, lightning strike. He stood tall, holding my hand so tightly I thought my bones might crack, absorbing my terrible grief while quietly bearing his own. The years that followed were incredibly difficult, but Owen kept the roof over our heads and the ground steady beneath my feet. He was a spectacular failure in the kitchen, serving up stubbornly burnt toast, terribly lumpy pasta, and baked meatloaf that heavily resembled a solid construction material. He folded my laundry with clumsy, irregular creases, but he showed up every single day. He attended every parent-teacher conference, clapped the loudest at my high school graduation, and made sure the house was never silent, even if it meant leaving the television blaring in the living room just to fill the agonizing void my mother left behind. He kept our small family unit standing upright through sheer stubborn willpower. That deeply ingrained lesson about survival and reconstruction heavily influenced my path into adulthood. I eventually built a career working for the Harbor Ridge Recovery Group. My company operates as a private firm specializing in complex disaster loss recovery. We step in immediately after hurricanes, wildfires, and catastrophic floods tear communities apart, helping devastated families and ruined businesses piece their shattered properties back together. I chose this highly demanding field because my entire upbringing taught me that repairing what is broken is the most profound act of love a person can commit. Owen taught me how to survey the massive damage, assess the structural integrity of what remains standing, and slowly rebuild from the ashes. And that is precisely why the events of this evening feel like a fatal bleeding wound. When a stranger insults you, it simply bounces off your armor. When an enemy attacks you, you instinctively fight back. But when the very man who knelt on a courthouse floor and legally swore to be your father suddenly stands before a crowd of over 80 people and loudly declares, "You are not his real daughter," the betrayal is absolute and total. Because Owen actually signed those adoption papers with his own hand, because he actively chose me. His words tonight were not just a cruel passing insult born of sudden anger. They were a precise, calculated knife strike meant to brutally sever the foundational root of my entire existence. He did not just push me down onto a hardwood floor. He took the beautiful, sturdy home we built together in the wake of my mother passing away, and he burned it entirely to the ground. Exactly 2 years after the sudden silence swallowed our home, the front door opened to let in a different kind of storm. It did not arrive with thunder or lightning. It arrived wearing a tailored cashmere coat and a perfectly calibrated smile. Her name was Celeste Arden. My father met her during a commercial property consultation. She was a high-end real estate broker who specialized in luxury desert properties. A woman who moved through the world with the absolute certainty that everything in existence could be significantly upgraded if you simply had enough money and the right kind of sophisticated taste. She did not walk into a room. She appraised it. She looked at our warm adobe home and saw only potential resale value and outdated aesthetics. Celeste did not come alone. She brought her daughter Sloane, who was exactly 1 year younger than I was. Sloane was a masterful study in calculated vulnerability. While I had been raised on construction sites, taught to stand my ground and speak my mind, Sloane knew exactly when to lower her eyelashes, when to let her voice tremble, and precisely who needed to see her act fragile. She possessed a terrifying instinct for finding the strongest person in the room and making them feel entirely responsible for her well-being. The invasion did not begin with a massive dramatic confrontation. Celeste was far too intelligent for a direct attack. She understood that if she demanded my father choose between us, his deeply ingrained loyalty would have forced him to protect me. So she simply became the interior designer of our demise. It started with the heavy woven curtains my mother had painstakingly chosen to keep the harsh afternoon sun at bay. Celeste casually mentioned that they made the living room feel incredibly small and depressing. Within 48 hours, they were replaced by sheer, icy white linen that let in a blinding, sterile light. Then came the paint. The warm, inviting terracotta walls were rolled over with a cold, lifeless shade she called agreeable gray. The most painful eraser happened to the photographs. There was no cruel announcement. So I just came home from high school one afternoon to find the hallway walls completely bare. The beautiful silver-framed portraits of my mother, the candid shots of us laughing in the kitchen, the fading Polaroids of our chaotic holiday dinners, they were all gone. When I asked about them, Celeste placed a gentle manicured hand on my arm and offered a sympathetic sigh. She explained that the old frames simply did not match the new modern aesthetic she was trying to achieve for Owen. She promised she had packed them away very safely in a cardboard storage box in the garage. Framing the act of hiding my mother as a generous favor to the architectural flow of the hallway, Sloane executed her own quiet offensive. Within the first 3 months of them moving in, she began calling Owen by the title of Dad. She did not do it in moments of genuine, overwhelming affection. She dropped the word into casual, everyday sentences with strategic repetition. She would ask Dad to pass the salt at the dinner table. She would ask Dad to check the tire pressure on her car. She turned the sacred title into a mundane ambient noise, repeating it over and over until it became completely normalized within the walls of our house. Every time she said it, I felt a sharp twist in my stomach, but pointing it out will only make me look wildly jealous and unreasonable. Simultaneously, Celeste began planting tiny toxic seeds in my father's mind. She did not insult me. She weaponized therapy language to gently push me toward the outer edges of the family circle. While pouring his morning coffee, she would casually remark that blended families require extremely clear, healthy boundaries to thrive. She would watch me studying at the kitchen island and loudly admire my independence, telling my father that he had raised such a strong girl who would undoubtedly build her own completely separate life very soon. She wrapped my exclusion in the deceptive language of maternal pride. She convinced him that letting go of me was not abandonment, but rather a necessary step for my own personal growth. She made him believe that pulling away was the right thing to do. By the time I packed my bags to leave for college and later to begin my career in disaster recovery, the foundation of my place in the family had already been severely hollowed out. Every single time I drove back home for a holiday or a long weekend, I discovered I had lost another piece of my physical history. The changes greeted me at the front door and followed me down the hall. My childhood bedroom, the place where I had spent countless hours reading library books and dreaming about the future, was systematically dismantled. I returned for Thanksgiving one year to find my heavy wooden bed replaced by sleek mirrors, rubber floor mats, and an expensive reformer machine. Celeste smiled and called it her new Pilates sanctuary, assuring me I could just sleep on the pull-out sofa in the basement. The towering, beautiful wooden bookshelf in the living room, the one my mother had filled with classic literature and poetry, was entirely ripped out of the wall. In its place stood a massive, humming, temperature-controlled wine refrigerator stocked with expensive imported vintages. The final, most devastating blow came during a brief visit when I needed a passport renewal. I asked Owen to open the heavy fireproof safe in his home office so I could retrieve my original birth certificate and my adoption papers. He spun the heavy metal dial, pulled open the door, and handed me my passport. But the weathered manila envelope containing the court documents from that autumn morning when I was 7 years old was nowhere to be found. When I panicked, Celeste calmly glided into the room. She coolly explained that she had taken the liberty of reorganizing all the messy legal files to save space. She claimed the adoption papers were perfectly safe in a secondary storage unit across town, dismissing my frantic anxiety as an overreaction to simple household management. My father never saw any of this as a hostile takeover. In his pragmatic engineering mind, a house was just a structure that required occasional updates and maintenance. He viewed the disappearing photos, the changing paint colors, and the repurposed rooms as minor, harmless adjustments made by a woman who simply wanted to keep the property tidy and modern. He could not see the psychological warfare playing out right in front of his eyes, and I was simply too exhausted to wage a screaming battle over every single rug, every replaced chair, or every lost picture frame. When you work in disaster recovery, you learn to pick your battles. You cannot save the entire neighborhood when the flood waters are still rising. You just try to keep your own head above the surface. The true, terrifying genius of my stepmother lay in her supreme patience. She never executed a massive heist. If she had tried to throw all my belongings out on the lawn in one single afternoon, Owen would have undoubtedly stopped her. Instead, she operated like a slow-moving glacier, carving out the landscape inch by agonizing inch. She took a tiny fraction of my life every single day. She moved slowly enough for my father to casually label the shifting dynamic as completely normal. Yet, she moved quickly enough that my fingers could never find a solid grip to hold onto anything. She stole my home, my history, and eventually my father, and she did it all with a polite smile and a color swatch in her hand. I met Noah Ruiz during a grueling 3-day data risk and disaster loss management conference in Denver. We were both standing near a lukewarm coffee urn, exhausted from consecutive seminars. Noah was not the loud, charismatic type who needed to command a room. He worked as a senior digital forensics expert for Stone Trace Discovery. He spent his days recovering deleted data, tracing hidden financial transfers, and proving that people were lying. He was a man who trusted server logs, metadata, and encrypted timestamps far more than he trusted human emotions or unreliable memories. In my chaotic professional world of shattered buildings and ruined properties, Noah was a solid concrete pillar. His absolute reliance on verifiable facts and digital footprints made him the most deeply trustworthy person I had ever known. Our wedding was a quiet, intimate affair held in a small botanical garden just outside the city limits. It rained for exactly 20 minutes right before the ceremony, but the sky cleared perfectly by the time we exchanged our vows. Owen walked me down the stone path. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and gripped my arm with a fierce, trembling pride. After the ceremony concluded, he pulled me into a tight embrace. I felt his hot tears against my cheek as he whispered that Marisol would be unimaginably proud of the woman I had become. He held both of my hands, looked deep into my eyes, and told me that walking me down the aisle was the absolute best moment of his 58 years on this earth. He danced with me. He toasted to our bright future. On that beautiful afternoon, I was absolutely certain I still had my father. He was right there, present and deeply loving. I had not lost him yet. The devastating shift did not happen overnight. It began exactly 4 months after my wedding following a severe rotator cuff tear that required Owen to undergo complex shoulder surgery. The procedure itself was routine, but the difficult recovery demanded heavy prescription painkillers and several weeks of strict bed rest. That period of intense physical vulnerability provided the perfect, frictionless entry point for total control. Celeste immediately stepped into the role of the devoted, exhausted caretaker. She took complete possession of his smartphone. She managed his daily pill schedule with militant precision. She organized his calendar, intercepted his incoming mail, and logged into his personal laptop to handle his banking and email correspondence. She built an invisible, impenetrable fortress around his recovery bed, isolating him completely from the outside world. I started noticing the subtle disturbing changes within the first 2 weeks of his convulsions. I would send long, cheerful text messages asking about his physical therapy progress only to receive brief, oddly formal replies. Several hours later, the tone was completely wrong. My father, a man who habitually typed with one stiff index finger and constantly misspelled simple words, was suddenly sending perfectly punctuated, sterile sentences. Then the emails changed. I received a message regarding his upcoming retirement planning that read like a drafted legal notice, completely stripped of any familial warmth. I would type out a paragraph about a new disaster relief contract I won, and the reply would simply be a cold acknowledgement instructing me to stop inquiring about his finances. It was bizarre. When I tried to call him, the phone would ring exactly 3 times before going straight to a generic voicemail. Eventually, the strange, cold messages stopped altogether. The communication simply flatlined into absolute terrifying silence. While I was sitting in my office staring at unreturned messages, Celeste was busy pumping pure concentrated poison directly into my father's medicated mind. She did not just suggest that I was busy with my new marriage. She orchestrated a brilliant, devastating narrative. She told Owen that my sudden distance was highly intentional. She whispered that Noah was secretly drowning in massive, unmanageable debt from failed investments. She planted the horrific idea that I was only waiting around to aggressively claim my legal half of the adobe house Marisol had left behind. But her most lethal strike was a completely fabricated quote. She somehow convinced Owen that I had drunkenly complained to a mutual family acquaintance, allegedly stating that Owen was never my real father anyway, and that I felt zero loyalty toward him. To back up these monstrous lies, Celeste did not rely on mere gossip. She manufactured physical proof. She presented my father with carefully doctor-printed email threads that appeared to show me demanding money. She showed him cropped, highly manipulated screenshots on her tablet. She wove a complex, highly toxic conspiracy theory claiming I was actively employing private investigators to track down my biological father. She told Owen I was doing this to legally annul my childhood adoption, thereby securing an exclusive legal claim to my late mother's separate financial assets before he could retire. To a man heavily sedated on narcotics, feeling physically weak and entirely dependent on his wife, these forged documents looked like undeniable reality. I fought desperately to break through the blockade. I called his phone 20 times a week. I sent handwritten birthday cards and carefully wrapped Christmas gifts via certified mail, hoping a signature requirement would force a delivery. I drove the 45M to their house on 2 separate occasions, both times. Celeste met me on the front porch with her arms crossed and a deeply sorrowful expression on her face. I stood on the concrete steps crying and begging her just to let me look at him from the hallway to ensure he was healing properly. She blocked the heavy wooden door, speaking in a hushed, sympathetic tone, telling me that Owen was simply too heartbroken by my greedy behavior to look at me. She said his blood pressure was dangerously high and that my presence would only trigger a fatal medical emergency. She turned me away, leaving me sobbing in my car, while she went back inside and told my father that I had not bothered to visit him a single time during his entire grueling recovery. For nearly 2 full years, I was systematically erased from my father's life. There was no explosive argument. There was no screaming match in the driveway. There was no dramatic confrontation where we aired our grievances and fought for our relationship. I was quietly, methodically erased from my own life by a barrage of intercepted technology, heavily managed prescription medication, and forged paper trails. I was completely defeated by a woman who possessed a terrifying, masterful talent for rewriting reality to perfectly suit her own financial and emotional needs. She built a mirrored maze around my father, feeding him a steady diet of perfectly crafted lies. By the time he finally recovered his physical strength and stopped taking the heavy painkillers, he was completely trapped in a false world where his only daughter had transformed into a heartless, greedy traitor. He did not simply forget me. He was expertly trained to actively despise the false version of me she had so carefully invented. The true motive behind my systematic exile had absolutely nothing to do with emotional jealousy, and it certainly had nothing to do with a desire for a harmonious, smoothly functioning, blended household. Beneath the polite smiles, the carefully chosen paint, color swatches, and the expertly manufactured grievances lay a foundation built entirely on cold, ruthless, and hard mathematics. My father was not simply a blue-collar man stepping down from a mid-level management job. After 30 grueling years of dedication to the power grid, spending thousands of hours repairing blown transformers in the middle of freezing desert nights, his retirement was set to trigger a massive, highly lucrative liquidity event. He was scheduled to receive an enormous deferred compensation package, a financial golden parachute specifically designed to reward his 3 decades of unbroken loyalty to the corporation. Alongside that massive cash payout, he held a vast, valuable portfolio of accumulated corporate bonus shares that had vested slowly over the course of his long career. But the absolute crown jewel of his financial estate, the single asset that required the most surgical and precise extraction, was the final unencumbered legal control over the Adobe duplex that my mother had originally secured. Marisol had been a quiet librarian, but she possessed a fierce, razor-sharp intelligence when it came to property and securing our future. When she bought that duplex years ago, she legally tethered the equity of the home directly to the county court order that established my adoption. The property records and the adoption decree were inextricably linked in the heavy, dusty archives of the county courthouse. As long as I remained his legally recognized daughter, a massive, undeniable portion of that highly appreciating real estate belonged unequivocally to me. Celeste, operating as a high-end real estate broker for years, understood the ruthless, unforgiving mechanics of probate, inheritance, and property law perfectly. She knew that simply asking Owen to write me out of a standard last will and testament was far too risky. A simple will could easily be contested by a competent lawyer in a courtroom, especially given my established history. To cleanly amputate my inheritance and seize the duplex without a messy legal battle, she had to fundamentally shake the legal legitimacy of my place in the family. She had to make the adoption itself look like a fraudulent, temporary mistake. This ruthless financial maneuvering was not born out of simple everyday greed. It was born out of desperate, suffocating, and terrifying panic. While my father's wealth was reaching its absolute peak, Sloane was secretly drowning in a catastrophic ocean of commercial and personal debt. The boutique fitness studio that she proudly flaunted on her social media accounts, posting daily photos of expensive imported exercise equipment and organic juice bars, was in reality a complete financial sinkhole. She had burned through all of her initial operating capital within the first 18 months of opening the doors. She was severely delinquent on her quarterly business taxes, playing a highly dangerous game of avoidance that would eventually invite aggressive federal audits and massive penalties. To keep the heavy glass doors open and the neon lights turned on, she had stacked predatory high-interest personal loans right on top of multiple maxed-out premium credit cards. Sloane was financially bleeding to death at a rapid pace, and my father's impending retirement package was the only blood transfusion large enough to save her from total, humiliating public ruin. Celeste was far too sophisticated and cunning to simply sit down and ask my father to pay off her daughter's massive, reckless debts. That direct approach would have completely shattered the carefully cultivated illusion of Sloane's fierce independence and business acumen. Instead, my stepmother quietly utilized her extensive knowledge of commercial real estate to establish an anonymous corporate entity. She registered a discreet, completely opaque shell company in a neighboring state with extremely lax corporate transparency laws, and she named it Sable North Holdings. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal misdirection and financial camouflage. She carefully pitched the concept to Owen during his vulnerable recovery period. Utilizing soft, highly responsible-sounding terminology, she called the shell company a necessary and prudent restructuring of their complex family assets. She framed it to him as a proactive, highly intelligent tax shelter specifically designed to protect his hard-earned wealth from government overreach during his golden years. In reality, Sable North Holdings was a highly engineered, fully operational vacuum. It was designed to seamlessly absorb the massive deferred compensation payout, the lucrative corporate shares, and the deed to the Adobe duplex the very second his final retirement papers were officially processed and signed. But a complex corporate shell game requires a highly credible, extremely compelling narrative to satisfy the inevitable scrutiny of sharp estate lawyers, cautious wealth managers, and observant corporate colleagues. Celeste could not simply transfer millions of dollars of assets to her own daughter without raising massive, insurmountable red flags across the entire financial sector. She had to meticulously construct Sloane's public image as the single, fiercely devoted, relentlessly loyal caretaker of the family. Every single time Sloane brought my father a glass of water, every time she drove him to a routine physical therapy appointment across town, it was deliberately and carefully performed in front of an audience. Celeste made absolutely sure the neighborhood association saw Sloane carrying the heavy groceries up the driveway. She made sure the visiting company executives heard glowing, tearful stories about Sloane sitting vigilantly by his bedside through the darkest nights of his painful recovery. They were not building a loving familial relationship. They were building an ironclad legal defense. They were actively manufacturing a verifiable, highly visible pattern of profound devotion to legitimize the impending massive transfer of wealth into the shell company. This is exactly why the systematic, quiet purging of the heady iron household safe was so absolutely critical to their covert operation. The old faded photographs of my mother and the sentimental childhood keepsakes were merely collateral damage in a much larger war. The true primary targets were the foundational legal anchors of my entire existence. They permanently removed the original certified copy of the adoption decree, the thick manila folders containing my mother's separate property records, and the deeply personal handwritten letter my father had penned on the exact day we stood together in the county courthouse. Those specific documents were the undeniable physical empirical proof that I was chosen, wanted, and legally cemented into the very foundation of his estate. By making those crucial papers vanish into thin air, Celeste eliminated the specific physical evidence that could empower me to hire a forensic accountant and successfully challenge the hostile takeover orchestrated through Sable North Holdings. She needed the paper trail in the safe to perfectly reflect the very same barren, empty reality she had successfully created in my old childhood bedroom. Yet stealing the vital court documents and setting up the sophisticated corporate shell was still not quite enough to guarantee absolute, unchallenged victory. For the massive financial heist to be completely airtight and immune to any future legal challenges, Celeste needed one final incredibly crucial element. She needed my father to surrender all of the assets willingly without a single shred of hesitation, doubt, or lingering paternal guilt. She needed him to believe deeply and righteously in his own heart that I was entirely unworthy of holding anything that carried his respected name. He had to view my complete disinheritance not as a cruel betrayal of his own vows, but as a necessary, completely justified act of self-defense against an ungrateful, opportunistic, and greedy stranger. She had to completely kill his deeply rooted love for me in order to cleanly harvest his money without his conscience putting up a fight. Therefore, the lavish, highly anticipated retirement banquet at the Copper Pine Lodge was never truly intended to be a joyous celebration of a long, successful engineering career. It was a carefully staged, incredibly high-stakes public execution of my legal and emotional standing. The sprawling ballroom, the corporate executives, the carefully edited slideshow, and the highly weaponized seating chart were all meticulously designed props in my stepmother's grand final act. She needed a crowded room full of influential, wealthy witnesses to watch my father publicly sever his final ties with me by manipulating him into aggressively and loudly declaring that Sloane was his true daughter and I was just an outsider who did not belong. Celeste was legally closing the loop. The party was the ultimate stage where my father would unknowingly stamp his own public seal of approval on a completely false narrative, effectively authorizing the theft of his own life's work and legacy while tossing me out into the cold night. It was the perfect, devastating crime, orchestrated flawlessly right under the blinding, expensive glow of the crystal chandeliers. I did not know it during those long months of agonizing silence, that my husband was never the type of man to accept a locked door without testing the hinges. Noah did not operate on gut feelings, wounded pride, or emotional intuition. He operated entirely on raw data. In his world of digital forensics at Stone Trace Discovery, human beings lied constantly, but server logs remained relentlessly honest. While I was sitting on our living room floor, weeping over unanswered text messages and questioning my entire self-worth, Noah was quietly booting up his secure terminal and hunting for the invisible fingerprints my stepmother had carelessly left behind in Sciaspace. The first thread unraveled purely by chance. Stone Trace Discovery ran automated municipal risk sweeps for their corporate clients, scanning public county databases for fraudulent property title transfers. During a routine background sweep of the Santa Isabel County Property Registry, an automated alert flagged a highly irregular preliminary transfer request. Noah was reviewing the batch of flagged files when a specific name flashed across his dual monitors. It was Owen Callahan. Noah immediately pulled the isolated file into his secure sandbox environment. The document was a preliminary request to sever a property deed, and it explicitly cited a certified copy of my childhood adoption decree as supporting evidence to invalidate my legal claim to the Adobe duplex. Noah downloaded the attached digital document and stripped it down to its core metadata. The results were glaringly contradictory. The file claimed to be a scanned copy of a 30-year-old courthouse document. However, the embedded digital footprint revealed that the portable document format file had been newly generated just 3 weeks prior utilizing a commercial desktop publishing software. The kerning, the pixel compression, and the specific digital artifacts did not match the strict archival scanning standards of the county courthouse. It was a newly fabricated forgery dressed up to look like a vintage legal filing. That single discrepancy was all the justification no one needed to launch a full-scale, silent digital audit of my father's entire electronic life. He moved methodically, utilizing back-channel data recovery techniques that were entirely invisible to the average consumer. His next target was the series of horrific, abusive emails my father had allegedly received from my account. I had sworn to Noah 1,000 times that I never wrote those terrible words. Noah believed me, but he needed empirical proof. He managed to extract the raw network routing headers from those specific email transmissions. The sender name displayed my email address, but the originating Internet protocol address told a completely different story. Those cruel relationship-destroying messages did not originate from our apartment. The network trace led directly back to the specific wireless router broadcasting from the living room of my father and Celeste. My stepmother had literally been sending vicious messages to her own husband, impersonating me from a laptop sitting just down the hallway. The investigation grew darker as Noah began cross-referencing financial actions with medical timelines. He gained access to the digital signature logs attached to the newly drafted property trust addendums, the exact legal documents designed to funnel my father's retirement wealth into the Sable North Holding shell company. Noah pulled the precise timestamps of every single electronic signature. He then placed those times directly alongside the medical billing records from my father's orthopedic shoulder surgery. The correlation was sickening. The legally binding digital signatures authorizing the massive transfer of wealth were executed at the exact hour my father was lying in an outpatient recovery bay. He had been heavily sedated, pumped full of intravenous painkillers and surgical anesthetics. My father had not signed anything. He was medically unconscious, while his wife drained his legacy on a mobile device next to his hospital bed. Noah still needed to understand exactly how Celeste had managed to maintain the total communication blackout for nearly 2 years without my father eventually getting suspicious. He analyzed the configuration files of my father's email client. He discovered a series of highly sophisticated concealed inbox rules. Any incoming message that contained my first name, my last name, or my specific email address was instantly diverted. The system was programmed to bypass the main inbox entirely, mark the message as read, and silently dump it into a buried archive folder that my father did not even know existed. Noah then pulled the carrier logs for the cellular device. My phone number had been manually added to the blocked caller directory at the route operating system level. Furthermore, a scheduled task had been set up to wipe the notification history clean every single night at exactly midnight. I had been shouting into a meticulously engineered digital void. But the absolute worst discovery, the one piece of evidence that transformed this situation from a simple case of financial fraud into a horrifying act of psychological violence, was found deep within a synchronized cloud storage folder. Noah decrypted a partially completed legal draft that made his blood run cold. It was a formal petition for a civil conservatorship. Celeste was not merely satisfied with stealing the deferred compensation and the real estate. She was actively laying the groundwork to have my father declared legally incompetent. The draft falsely described him as suffering from severe cognitive decline and mental instability following his retirement. This was her ultimate insurance policy. If my father ever woke up from her manipulations and realized the money was completely gone, he would be legally paralyzed. He would have no authority to hire a lawyer, access his own bank accounts, or file a police report. She was preparing to steal his basic human autonomy. Noah sat on this mountain of devastating evidence for weeks. He did not say a single word to me about the forged documents, the spoofed internet addresses, or the impending conservatorship. He watched me cry myself to sleep. He held me while I grieved the loss of a father who was still alive. He kept his silence because he understood the brutal reality of our situation. If he had shown me a half-finished investigation, I would have immediately driven over to that house in a blind emotional rage. I would have confronted them with insufficient ammunition. Celeste, being the master manipulator she was, would have simply feigned ignorance, quietly deleted the digital trails, and used my explosive outburst as further proof that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. No one knew that we could not afford to wound the beast. We had to decapitate it in one single undeniable strike. He needed a watertight case. He needed to ensure that when the truth finally came out, no amount of crying or gaslighting from Celeste could possibly save her. The waiting game finally ended the day the mass email invitation for the retirement banquet landed in our inbox. I saw it as a cruel taunt, a final slap in the face. Noah saw it as the ticking clock. He immediately checked the dates on the preliminary transfer requests and the conservatorship draft. The execution of the wealth transfer to the Svel company along with the filing of the competency petition were scheduled to be formally submitted to a judge on the very next business morning following the retirement party. The banquet at the Copper Pine Lodge was not just a fancy corporate send-off. It was the absolute final hour. It was the narrow closing window before the concrete completely set over my father's grave. No one knew that this was no longer a private family dispute that could be resolved in a quiet living room. This was an active crime scene, and the only way to stop the final blow was to drag the entire conspiracy out into the blinding light of a crowded room. As we got dressed for the party that evening, Noah slipped the thick red envelope filled with every piece of printed forensic evidence into his tailored jacket. He was not walking into a celebration. He was walking into a courtroom, and he was bringing the exact hammer needed to shatter my stepmother's entire world. The digital invitation arrived on a mundane Tuesday afternoon, buried deep beneath promotional retail newsletters and utility billing statements. It did not come accompanied by a warm phone call from my father. The sender address belonged exclusively to the corporate event planning division of High Desert Grid Services. It was a sterile automated mass distribution sent to a massive blind copy list. Seeing my own name sitting on that generic roster was a sharp, painful revelation. It meant my father had not personally requested my presence. It simply meant my old contact information had miraculously survived in the deepest forgotten archives of a human resources database, completely overlooked by my stepmother when she was systematically purging his personal address book. I sat in front of my glowing monitor for nearly an entire hour, my index finger hovering rigidly over the delete key. Every single protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to permanently erase the message, to stay locked inside my safe apartment, and to spare myself the crushing indignity of crushing a corporate garler where my total absence was the strongly desired outcome. I was deeply terrified of facing the very man who had frozen me out of his universe. But Noah walked into the home office, placed his warm, heavy hands gently on my shoulders, and looked down at the glowing screen. He did not offer empty, comforting platitudes about family always finding a way back together. Instead, he delivered a single unyielding truth. He told me that a lie absolutely loves a locked room, and tonight we were going to drag their massive fiction out into the brightest light possible. Getting dressed for the retirement banquet felt significantly less like preparing for a joyous celebration and much more like strapping on heavy armor for a final unwinnable battle. I bypassed the delicate gold chains in my jewelry box and reached straight for the heavy oxidized silver and turquoise cuff bracelet that had belonged to Marisol. The raw stones were cold and rough against my pulse. It was not a fashion statement. It was a physical, undeniable anchor to my true lineage. I then opened my small evening clutch. I did not pack extra makeup or a compact mirror. I carefully slid the old creased photograph of my father proudly signing my legal adoption papers right against the silk lining. I did not bring it to wave around the room like a theatrical prop. I brought it to serve as a private, unbreakable tether to reality. I knew exactly what kind of psychological warfare awaited me. Whenever the gaslighting became too suffocating, I needed to physically touch that piece of paper to remind myself that my place in that family was historically real, legally binding, and fiercely chosen. The Copper Pine Lodge was dripping in extravagant manufactured elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the massive floral centerpieces, but the atmosphere inside the grand foyer felt entirely devoid of genuine warmth. As Noel and I made our way across the thick, expensive carpets, the social tension was immediate and completely suffocating. The massive ballroom was packed with over 80 guests, and I recognized nearly every single face. There were the veteran line foremen who used to let me wear their yellow hard hats when I was a little girl. There were the senior executives who had eaten my mother's spicy cooking at company summer barbecues. But as I walked past their beautifully decorated tables, their reactions were uniform and terrifying. Joyous conversations abruptly stopped. Eyes darted nervously down to their expensive cocktail glasses. The guests had clearly been prepped for a very specific narrative over the past 2 years. They knew I was the disgraced, arranged, and greedy daughter, and absolutely no one in that room was mentally prepared for me to actually show up and shatter their comfortable, polite illusion. The stark contrast between the luxurious setting and my own public humiliation was agonizing, while I was banished to the darkest corner of the ballroom, sitting in the gloomy shadows of the swinging kitchen doors. Sloane was holding court under the brightest lights at the front of the room. She wore a stunning floor-length silk gown that undoubtedly cost thousands of borrowed dollars, paid for by the very man she was secretly bankrupting. She laughed musically, touching the arms of the wealthy vice presidents, behaving flawlessly as the sole devoted eyes to the Callahan legacy. Celeste treated my arrival exactly like a minor pest infestation, a temporary nuisance that could be easily managed with a cold smile and a highly strategic degrading seating assignment. When the commemorative slideshow began to play, displaying a fabricated timeline where my entire childhood had been cleanly erased, the true gravity of my stepmother's grand plan finally locked into place. I sat in the dim light, watching my father smile warmly next to the very woman who was systematically draining his financial accounts. I realized in that dark corner that the visual eraser on the large projector screen was simply a metaphor for the legal eraser happening on paper. They were not just rewriting memories. They were establishing a new legal precedent in front of corporate witnesses. The final devastating confirmation of this theory did not come from the stage. It came from the shadows. Halfway through the roasted tenderloin dinner service, a small figure slipped away from a middle-tier guest table and hurried toward our banished corner. It was my Aunt Rosa Vieger, my mother's older sister. She was breathing heavily, her wrinkled hands trembling violently as she gripped the edge of our small table. Rosa still worked as a senior filing clerk at the county administration building, a quiet, observant woman who practically lived among dusty municipal archives. She did not bother with pleasantries or asking how my husband was doing. She leaned down, her voice a terrified, urgent whisper that barely cut through the clinking silverware. She told me that Celeste had not merely hidden the framed family photos in a garage cardboard box. Roser had utilized her employee access to check the Municipal Property Trust Registry that very morning, searching for the deed to the Adobe duplex. She looked me dead in the eye, her face completely drained of color, and revealed that my stepmother had somehow managed to have the official county court seal entirely removed from the digital trust files linked to the property. The massive ballroom spun violently around me. The heavy turquoise bracelet suddenly felt like the heavy iron shackle cutting into my wrist. Removing a certified court seal from a property trust was not a petty household slight or an act of emotional jealousy. It was a massive, highly illegal tampering of public municipal records, a felony designed specifically to completely sever the final legal bridge between my childhood adoption and my mother's real estate. Aunt Rose's terrifying words made the true stakes of the evening crystal clear. This was no longer a petty social game of playing favorites. If I sat quietly at this back table, swallowed my immense pride, and let the night end without uttering a single word of protest, Celeste would win a total, irreversible victory. She would not just walk away with my father's emotional loyalty. She would walk away with the completely sanitized, legally unchallengeable title to everything my mother had ever built. If I remained silent, allowing them to toast to their fake family, the false story they were actively telling under the chandeliers would permanently become the absolute legal truth by Monday morning. I knew right then, staring at my aunt's terrified face, that staying seated in the shadows was no longer a survivable option. The polite applause following my stepmother's speech was sickeningly uniform. It rolled through the ballroom like a well-rehearsed wave. Celeste smiled modestly, adjusting the microphone stand before gliding back to her seat at the head table. The master of ceremonies, A senior vice president who had known our family for 2 decades immediately took her place at the podium. He adjusted his glasses and looked affectionately toward my father. Then he raised his crystal glass high into the warm golden light of the chandeliers. He announced that he wanted to invite someone very special to deliver the final toast of the evening. He leaned into the microphone and called for Sloane, explicitly introducing her as the one child who was always by Owen's side during his absolute hardest years. The words were a masterclass in psychological warfare. They were perfectly written, thoroughly vetted by Celeste, and designed to function as a public execution of my character. The phrase was a jagged knife, plunging straight into the center of my chest. It implied that while my father was suffering through his agonizing shoulder surgery, I was out in the world living a selfish life, completely abandoning the man who raised me. The sheer audacity of the lie, broadcasted over a state-of-the-art sound system to a room full of my father's oldest colleagues, broke the final thread of my restraint. I stood up. I did not throw my linen napkin on the table or knock over my watered glass. I simply rose from my chair in the dark corner of the room. The legs of the chair scraped softly against the floorboards, but in the sudden expectant hush of the ballroom, it sounded like a gunshot. I stepped away from the shadows and began the long walk toward the front of the room. I felt every single eye in the massive hall lock onto my moving figure. The low hum of conversation died instantly. The clinking of expensive silverware against china ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick and heavy like the air right before a violent desert storm. As I passed the beautifully decorated tables, I felt exactly like a condemned prisoner walking into a merciless courtroom without legal representation. The guests stared at me with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound discomfort, watching the arranged, ungrateful daughter dare to interrupt the perfect corporate fairy tale. Every step felt like wading through wet cement, but I refused to lower my gaze. I finally reached the edge of the elevated head table. I did not cause a chaotic scene. I did not raise my voice or hurl dramatic accusations at my stepmother. I stood perfectly straight, looking past the elaborate floral centerpieces, and locked my gaze entirely on the man who had taught me how to read blueprints and ride a bicycle. I spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that carried easily through the silent room. I asked him a single simple question. I asked if after 2 full years of absolute agonizing silence, he could finally find the courage to look me directly in the eye and tell me exactly what had changed. For one brief, agonizing second, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion cross my father's face. His eyes darted nervously between me and the silent crowd. But before he could even process the weight of my question, the carefully constructed defense mechanism sprang into action. Celeste leaned in close, her perfectly styled hair brushing against his shoulder. She whispered something incredibly fast and venomous directly into his ear. Simultaneously, Sloane reached out and gripped his hand tightly, an anchoring physical reminder of the false reality they had built for him. She was silently demanding that he stick strictly to the script. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The brief moment of vulnerable hesitation vanished completely, replaced by a cold, hardened fury. My father became a stranger. He stood up abruptly, his chair sliding backward with a harsh screech. He stepped entirely around the large wooden table and positioned his tall frame directly in front of the single empty chair, physically barricading it with his body. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. His voice was no longer the warm, rumbling baritone that used to read me bedtime stories. It was sharp, cruel, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. He told me that I had used him enough for one lifetime. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and stated loudly enough for the first 3 rows of guest tables to hear every devastating syllable that I was not his real daughter. He sneered the words, twisting the blade deeper, and declared that tonight was a celebration for his actual family and there was absolutely no place here for greedy outsiders. The words struck me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. My brain short-circuited, unable to reconcile the loving man from my childhood with the cruel stranger standing before me. I could not breathe. I could not move. I just stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public rejection. I did not cry out, and I did not step backward. I remained frozen in place, staring at him in total shock. My lack of immediate retreat seemed to infuriate him further. The tension in his jaw snapped. He raised his large calloused hand, the exact same hand that had once safely guided me down the aisle at my wedding, and he placed it firmly against my shoulder. Then, with a sudden, shocking burst of aggressive force, he pushed me. He pushed me hard. My tall heels betrayed me against the polished hardwood floor. I stumbled backward, my arms flailing wildly as the entire ballroom tilted on its axis. I hit the solid ground with a sickening heavy thud. The physical impact knocked the wind entirely out of my lungs, but the emotional impact shattered my entire world. I tasted the faint metallic tang of blood where I had bitten the inside of my cheek. As I fell, my wrist struck the edge of a nearby guest table. The heavy silver and turquoise bracelet that had belonged to Marisol unclasped violently, clattering loudly against the wood. My small evening purse slipped from my grasp and burst open upon impact. The old faded photograph spilled out. It slid smoothly across the polished floor, coming to a dead stop right at the tips of the expensive leather shoes worn by the completely stunned corporate executives in the front row. The picture lay perfectly face up under the bright chandelier light. It was the undeniable image of Owen, 30 years younger, smiling with overwhelming pride as he signed my legal adoption papers at the county courthouse. The visual contradiction between the man in the photograph and the man standing above me drew a collective, horrified gasp from the surrounding crowd. The silence was broken only by the sound of 80 people simultaneously holding their breath before I could even attempt to gather my breath or pull myself up from the floor. A swift blur of silk moved above me. Sloane did not hesitate for a single second. She did not look down at me with pity or shock. She simply glided forward and sat down directly into the empty chair my father had just guarded. She claimed the seat with a terrifying rehearsed precision, completely solidifying her position as the victor. It was as if she had been waiting her entire life for the exact moment I would be forcefully thrown to the ground so she could take my rightful place. She smoothed her expensive dress and looked straight ahead, perfectly composed, while I lay humiliated at her feet. Then the heavy atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. The sound of deliberate, unhurried footsteps echoed through the stunned silence. Noah walked steadily from the shadows of our banished table. He moved through the parted sea of horrified guests with the calculated grace of an executioner. He bypassed the whispering colleagues and walked straight to where I lay. He did not scream at my father or throw a violent punch. He knelt down, his strong hands gently grasping my arms, and hoisted me securely back onto my feet. He brushed the dust from my dress with a quiet, fierce tenderness, wrapping a protective arm around my waist to steady my trembling frame. Noah looked down and saw the faded adoption photograph resting on the floor. He stared at it for a brief moment, his jaw setting into a rigid line of pure granite. He did not bother picking it up. He left it there as a glaring monument to their cruelty. Noah slowly turned his head and locked his dark, intense eyes directly onto my father. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. When Noah finally spoke, his voice was not elevated in rage. It was low, perfectly calm, and chillingly precise. It was the voice of a man who held the absolute power to destroy a life, and was fully prepared to use it. He looked Owen dead in the eye and delivered a sentence that made the temperature in the massive ballroom drop 10. He stated that before we turned around and walked out of this building, my father urgently needed to see exactly what his loving wife had secretly filed under his name. Noah did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He did not throw his hands in the air. And he did not make a theatrical scene. Anger is a weapon for people who lack solid evidence. And my husband was holding a loaded gun constructed entirely out of undeniable data. He reached his hand inside his tailored jacket and slowly withdrew the thick red envelope. He stepped right up to the edge of the head completely, ignoring the extravagant crystal and floral centerpieces, and placed the envelope flat on the pristine white tablecloth. The sound of the heavy paper hitting the wood was dull but definitive, like a judge dropping a heavy wooden gavel. Noah broke the secure seal. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized stack of documents. The very first piece of paper he slid across the polished wood toward my father was a freshly stamped certified copy of my official adoption decree. Noah looked out at the completely silent ballroom, his voice ringing out with an absolute terrifying calm. He stated clearly before all 80 guests that I was the legal daughter of Owen Callahan. He did not say I used to be his daughter. He emphasized that I still was legally and permanently his child. My father hesitated, then slowly reached out and picked up the paper. I watched his hands begin to tremble violently as his eyes scanned the page. He saw the raised, authentic seal of the county court. He saw the signature of the presiding judge. He saw the exact date, the 12th of November, written out clearly. Most devastatingly, attached to the back of the decree was a high-quality photocopy of the deeply personal handwritten letter my father had penned to me on that exact same day. Celeste had looked him right in the eye months ago and sworn that these specific documents had been legally invalidated and permanently destroyed. Yet here they were, proving that the foundational truth of our family was still completely intact. Before my father could even open his mouth to form a question, Noah placed a second stack of papers right on top of the first. These pages were covered in dense, highly technical text. They were the raw printed routing headers from the series of horrific, abusive emails my father believed I had been sending him. Noah explained the data in a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. He stated that the vicious, unforgiving messages that had shattered my father's heart over the past 24 months were entirely fabricated. Noah pointed a steady, unyielding finger at a specific sequence of numbers printed near the top of the page. He explained to the crowd that those specific Internet protocol addresses proved definitively that the emails never originated from our apartment located across the state. The digital footprint traced directly back to a laptop logged into Celeste's personal user account, transmitting through the exact same wireless internet router located inside Owen's own living room. My stepmother had literally been sitting on her own couch, typing out horrific insults under my name and sending them directly to her husband, who was resting just down the hallway. She had perfectly framed me as a heartless monster without ever leaving her house. The color completely drained from my father's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored suit. He slowly turned his head to look at Celeste, who was suddenly gripping the edge of the dining table so incredibly hard that her knuckles were entirely white. But Noah was absolutely relentless. He stepped 1 inch closer to my father and issued a calm, direct command. He instructed Owen to take his cellular phone out of his suit pocket right that very second. My father, moving sluggishly like a man trapped in a terrible nightmare, complied. Noah guided him through the digital maze, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single instruction. He told my father to open his email application, navigate to the advanced settings, and open the hidden archive folders. He then instructed him to open the main phone settings and scroll down to the blocked caller directory. I watched my father's chest begin to heave rapidly as he stared down at his own glowing screen. The terrible truth was right there in the palm of his hand, hidden deep within the operating system, completely obscured from daily view, were my phone number and my primary email address. Noah stated flatly that every single birthday message, every desperate voicemail, every holiday greeting, and every single plea for connection I had sent over the past 2 years had been systematically intercepted, blocked, and buried by the woman pretending to be his devoted caretaker. The stunned silence in the massive ballroom finally broke. A wave of shocked murmurs began to swell across the room. The polite, wealthy corporate facade was rapidly crumbling into dust. Noah reached into the envelope again and laid down the next piece of evidence. It was a certified log of electronic signatures attached to the recent property trust addendums. Noah asked my father a highly specific question. He asked where my father was on the morning of the 14th of September at exactly 10:00. My father swallowed hard, his voice barely a raspy whisper, stating he was at the outpatient surgical clinic having his torn shoulder repaired. Noah nodded slowly. He tapped the printed log and announced to the entire room that at that precise hour, while my father was completely unconscious and heavily sedated with intravenous narcotics, an electronic signature legally authorizing the massive transfer of his real estate assets was executed from a mobile device. Noah pointed directly to the geographic coordinates recorded by the security software, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the signature was not cast from the hospital recovery room, but from the geographic location of my father's private residence. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom completely inverted. This was no longer a messy private family drama spilling out in public. This was a forensic dissection of a major financial crime happening live in front of dozens of high corporate witnesses. A senior vice president sitting just 2 tables away stared at Celeste with an expression of pure unadulterated horror, looking at her as if she were a dangerous, unrecognizable stranger. Longtime colleagues who had known my father for 3 decades began whispering frantically to their spouses. Sloane, who had been sitting so triumphantly and comfortably in my stolen chair just a few minutes prior, began to visibly panic. Her poised, elegant posture completely collapsed. She shrank back against the wood. My father slowly turned his head away from the damning paperwork and looked directly at his stepdaughter. His voice was broken, shaking with a devastating mixture of profound betrayal and desperate denial. He asked Sloane point blank if she knew anything about this elaborate deception. Cornered, terrified by the sudden, heady hostility of the entire room and lacking her mother's iron composure, Sloane completely cracked. She threw her hands up defensively and blurted out that her mother was only fixing the legal files to match what Dad actually wanted anyway. It was a fatal, catastrophic slip of the tongue. In her frantic, selfish attempt to deflect the immediate blame away from herself, Sloane accidentally confirmed the absolute worst truth. She unwittingly admitted to the entire room that this was not a series of unfortunate administrative errors or simple technological misunderstandings. It was a calculated, premeditated conspiracy, and she had been entirely aware of the plot the entire time. Celeste closed her eyes tightly, her face twisting in fury, knowing her own daughter had just destroyed their very last remaining line of defense. My father looked completely hollowed out. The crowd was stunned into absolute silence, believing the terrible truth was now fully exposed. Everyone thought the absolute worst was over, but Noah remained standing tall, his expression completely unchanged. He placed his hands flat on the table, leaned forward, and delivered a final sentence that made the blood run absolutely cold in the veins of every single person listening. He looked right at my father and stated clearly that all of this was still not the worst part, because the thing they were planning to take on Monday morning was much bigger. Noah reached his hand back into the thick red envelope for the absolute last time. The entire grand ballroom held its collective breath, the heavy silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Noah withdrew a final, heavily stapled packet of legal documents. He did not gently hand this packet to my father. He held it up high so the stark black text was clearly visible under the bright chandelier light. He announced to the crowd that this was the master stroke. In a voice completely devoid of any sympathy, he detailed the intricate legal transfer of the Adobe duplex and the massive deferred compensation package. He explained how every single dollar of my father's retirement wealth was being routed directly into a corporate entity known as Sable North Holdings. Noah looked directly at Sloane, who was trembling violently in her stolen chair, and stated clearly that she was the sole registered proprietor of this shadowy shell company. He revealed that the financial transfer was legally binding and set to execute the very second my father signed his official retirement papers on Monday morning. But Noah was still not finished dismantling their empire. He dropped the financial transfer documents onto the pristine white tablecloth and pulled out a single devastating legal draft. It was the petition for a civil conservatorship. Noah read the clinical degrading language aloud to the utterly silent room. The document was prepared to declare my father legally incompetent, describing him in extensive legal jargon as suffering from severe cognitive decline and mental instability following his orthopedic surgery. It was a vicious insurance policy entirely designed to grant Celeste absolute unquestionable control over every single remaining asset he owned, ensuring he could never legally fight back, even if he discovered the missing money. The immaculate, high society facade my stepmother had meticulously cultivated for years instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. The polite, sophisticated real estate broker vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. Celeste let out a roar, desperate scream. She lunged violently across the dining table, knocking over expensive crystal wine glasses, her manicured hands clawing frantically at the printed pages. She shrieked at the top of her lungs that she had done it all because her daughter deserved a decent life, a life far better than what a dusty, exhausted construction manager could naturally provide. She screamed that they were owed this massive fortune as payment for putting up with his boring, pathetic existence for so many years. That single, venomous, unhinged outburst completely destroyed the loving, devoted wife persona she had spent countless hours building. There was absolutely no more gaslighting left to perform. She had just confessed to her own malice in front of over 80 corporate witnesses. Sloane, completely trapped under the burning, judgmental stares of the wealthy executives and their spouses, fell apart completely. The heavy tears ruined her expensive makeup as she pushed her chair back, physically distancing herself from her own mother. She cried out a desperate, highly calculated half-truth to save herself. She loudly admitted she knew all about the corporate shell company and the stolen money. She confessed they had practiced the exact script for tonight, planning the precise moment she would take my chair and the exact insult they would use to call me an outsider. But she stared at the conservatorship petition with genuine, unadulterated horror. She swore through her frantic sobbing that she had absolutely no idea her mother was planning to have Owen declared mentally incompetent just to seize the rest of his estate. The thieves, realizing they were completely trapped, were finally turning on each other in an attempt to survive. My father stood completely rigid, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his own utter ruin. He looked around the extravagant room, finally understanding that this lavish retirement banquet was never intended to be a celebration of his long successful career. It was the final triumphant stage of a perfectly orchestrated robbery, and he was the gullible mark. He slowly turned his head away from the two weeping women he had blindly trusted and faced the crowded ballroom. His broad shoulders slumped, his voice cracked, heavy with the devastating weight of a man who had foolishly thrown away his only real family. He looked directly at the crowd of his peers and stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room, that I was his true daughter. He declared that he had actively chosen me, and the only absolute failure standing in the room tonight was himself. He took a slow, heady step toward me, his arms slightly open, desperately seeking the immediate comfort and quick forgiveness he used to receive when I was a little girl with scraped knees. I did not step forward to embrace him. I held my ground firmly. The betrayal I had endured for 2 years was far too deep for a quick cinematic hug in front of an audience. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes and demanded that he speak the absolute truth out loud, right in front of the very people he had allowed to humiliate me. I forced him to repeat to the entire room that he was the one who happily signed my adoption papers all those years ago. I made him confess to his colleagues that he had chosen to believe obvious toxic lies simply because he was far too tired and too much of a coward to face the difficult conflict inside his own home. I made him admit that he had violently pushed away the only person in his entire life who had never once betrayed him. He bowed his head, the tears falling freely onto his expensive tailored suit, and he repeated every single word I demanded. The retribution that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. My father did not wait for the morning light to take action. He signaled the large lodge security guards standing near the main exit and ordered them to immediately escort Celeste and Sloane off the private premises. He then turned to the front row of guest tables and called out for the lead corporate attorney of High Desert Grid Services. Right there, amidst the half-eaten plates of roasted tenderloin and spilled wine, they began drafting the emergency legal injunctions to permanently freeze every single financial account, retirement fund, and property title associated with his name. The senior vice presidents and longtime colleagues who had looked at me with open disgust just 1 hour ago now stood up respectfully from their chairs. They walked over to where Noah and I stood, offering their quiet, sincere apologies and firmly shaking my hand. It was the ultimate, undeniable public vindication delivered squarely on the exact stage Celeste had built to permanently erase my existence. The aftermath of that night played out exactly like a ruthless, fast-paced American legal thriller. By the end of the very next month, a massive federal property fraud investigation was fully underway. The illicit transfer of the Adobe duplex was permanently blocked by a county judge. Sloan was currently facing catastrophic civil liability lawsuits for her primary role in establishing the fraudulent shell company, and her fitness studio was officially forced into bankruptcy. Celeste was looking down the barrel of multiple felony forgery charges and criminal fraud indictments, her luxurious lifestyle entirely decimated by crippling legal fees. I finally received the heavy brass keys to my mother's Adobe duplex. Walking through the front door and reclaiming the space that was rightfully mine, I took the faded, creased adoption photograph that had fallen onto the ballroom floor and placed it safely behind a solid oak frame in my living room. As for my father, we did not magically revert to the way things used to be before the betrayal. The emotional damage was far too severe for easy, unspoken forgiveness. He visits the duplex on Sunday afternoons, and we sit on the back porch drinking cinnamon coffee. We are slowly rebuilding our fractured relationship from the ground up, brick by agonizing brick. It is a harsh, incredibly difficult process, but for the very first time in years, our foundation is finally built on the absolute truth. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the like button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.